Next up, please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Abernethy, the Principal Deputy Commissioner of Food and Drugs at the FDA. Dr. Abernethy oversees FDA's regulation of drugs, medical devices, tobacco, and food. In her role as Acting Chief Information Officer, she oversees FDA's data and technical vision. Recently, she has worked on the FDA's response to COVID-19, including research initiatives that collect and analyze real-world data to better understand and respond to the pandemic. Dr. Abernethy is an internationally recognized oncologist and palliative medicine physician. Before joining the FDA, she served as Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Officer, and Senior Vice President for Oncology at Flatiron Health. She also ran the Center for Learning Healthcare in the Duke Cancer Research Institute and the Duke Cancer Care Research Program in the Duke Cancer Institute. And the Duke Cancer Institute is one of the NCCN's 30 member institutions. Dr. Abernethy's expertise in cancer data, real-world evidence, clinical trials, patient-reported outcomes, patient-centric care are an invaluable asset to this discussion, and we're honored that she has joined us today. And with this, I will turn it over to Dr. Goodman and Dr. Abernethy.
Great, thanks very much, Bob. Dr. Abernethy, you just heard Bob Carlson give you a wonderful sort of description of your career and so forth. In a moment, I'm going to ask you a set of questions. The first one of which is, Amy, how'd you get from your role as a medical oncologist at Duke to your present position at FDA? Aside from the sort of benchmarks along the way, how does your thinking evolve since being at Duke to the point where you are now? Just a heads up to our listeners and our observers, this fireside chat is going to go to 50 minutes after the hour. At 40 minutes after the hour, we'll go to questions and answers. So Amy, can you just give us a quick rendition of how not only you went from point A to point Z, but how your thinking has evolved along the way?
So first of all, it's a huge honor to be here with NCCN today. I feel like I'm coming home and with you, Cliff and Bob, so thank you very much for having me. I think that if I look across my career, I've been focused on the same thing each step along the way, which is how do we take better care of the person sitting right in front of us, and how do we do so of finding the right treatment with a sense of urgency. And at my time at Duke, that was the question, certainly at Flatiron and now at FDA. And so really, as I think about how my thinking has evolved, I've continued to focus on the same question, but I've tried to figure out how do I bring new tool sets to actually solving this. So, first it was from the academic perspective, and then from the health tech and essentially startup and venture perspective, and now really asking the question, how do you use the tool suite of the laws and the regulations to continue to accelerate and innovate in this space? And I've learned a lot about that.
Okay, so that evolution in your career has fueled an evolution in your thinking, which brings you to your present position. Mm-hmm. Amy, I'm going to kind of queue up a set of questions for you, a set of topics for you, so that not only you, but our audience will have an idea for where we think you want to head here with this. So a couple of things we want to follow up on is kind of a story arc, if you would. One has to do back to the 21st Century's Cure Act. What is it about the act that has changed how we generate and use data? That's one thing. And as a sub-question to that, what's the special role of oncology in how we generate and use data? Then I hope you can move to something about the evolution of the capacity of using real-world data, real-world evidence on how we try to manage the current public health crisis in COVID. So RWD, RWE, what you learned from oncology, and can you now apply it to COVID? I know you get umpteen calls and gajillion emails on that every single day. And then if you can get to it, is there some sort of intersection that you might want to address of innovation in oncology and the COVID crisis? Is there an intersection? Is there kind of a Venn diagram overlap there? I suspect you might have an idea on that. Then a patient perspective, if you can get to it, how is COVID maybe affecting cancer patients? What has changed there? And then finally, I know you're big on patient-centered care, and I don't know if you want to weave that throughout, but if you can build that into that storyline, that story arc, that would be great. Although it's a heck of a challenge to do by 40 minutes after the hour. So give it your best if you don't mind, please.
Let's see if we can pull this off.
Okay.
So first, let's start with 21st century cures, and that's where you wanted to start the story arc. And I think that sort of sets up for today's conversation as we think about cures and potentially going to the future. And 21st century cures, it really actually set the stage for accelerating the role of real-world data and also patient-focused drug development. So practically speaking, 21st century cures compelled the FDA to develop a point of view about how we were going to incorporate real-world data and real-world evidence into the regulatory paradigm. Now, specifically, 21st century cures gave us 2 use cases to work on. Said that we should be thinking about the role of real-world data and real-world evidence within the context of supplemental indications. So not the initial approval of a drug, but the approval of a drug for indications beyond that first approval. And then also for post-marketing commitments and post-marketing requirements. So the understanding of how a drug performs, both from an effectiveness and safety perspective after approval. And that then led to a framework put out by the FDA in December of 2018 as the first piece of this story that said that real-world data needs to be fit for purpose if we're going to put it to regulatory use. The analysis needs to be appropriate and fit for purpose. And then we need to understand what contexts, what use cases where we can have fit for purpose data analyses to put those into play. Certainly the 2 contexts, supplemental indications or label expansions, what we often like to call it in oncology, as well as post-marketing commitments and requirements are the 2 use cases that were set out in the law. But also there's a number of other use cases that are being explored after that 2018 framework. Everything from the design of clinical trials to potentially development of things like synthetic or real-world control arms. So a large distribution, but that was really set out in the law in 2016. So December 2016 was cures, and that story is playing out, and anticipated guidances will come out from the FDA over the sort of subsequent year or 2.
Okay, well that's a lot to cover right there. I think, tell us a little bit about cancer care oncology in particular. What's the oncology angle a little bit more in RWD and RWE? How has this field made a contribution and or how might it benefit from those developments?
So it's interesting. I think oncology then becomes center stage in this story. So there are a couple of things to note here. So first of all, 21st century cures highlighted the role of real-world data and real-world evidence and patient-focused drug design, but that was not therapeutic specific, right? That wasn't specific to oncology. But meanwhile, in oncology, we had a number of innovations already taking place and actually really fertile ground to take the ideas outlined in cures and put them into action. What do we mean by that fertile ground? So first of all, we have the history of the NCCN databases that were essentially registries that were being collected as longitudinal databases in diseases like breast cancer and lymphoma and colorectal disease in the 2000s that set the stage for us to think about collecting high quality, replicable, real-world data within the context of the cancer setting. And actually taught us a lot about information that could be collected directly from the clinical case notes and also by abstracting information into registries. And even though that program was sunsetted, practically speaking, the ethos has continued on within oncology. We then had sort of the evolution of new technologies that allowed us to actually have really high quality real-world data sets. And practically speaking, that work happened first in oncology. So the ability to use technology-enabled data curation. So instead of hand abstracting all of the information from the chart, now using a combination of people and technology to do that at scale and create really high quality data sets derived from the electronic health record, but inclusive of many of those variables that were otherwise hard to get at. And so those kinds of data sets became available in oncology much differently than other areas. And the other thing that happened in oncology was we got good at combining electronic health record data that had been well curated together with, for example, biology, basic biologic data sets, so that we ended up with biospecimens, next generation sequencing, coupled with longitudinal clinical data, so that you end up with data sets that have got rich clinical information sitting next to rich biological information, and that kind of information coming across time. What's interesting is that story happened in oncology and has led to the majority of the use cases that have gotten developed from the standpoint of the real world data sets that are being put to test on the regulatory side happening in oncology. So some of the first supplemental indications, thinking about post-marketing indications, post-marketing requirements in oncology, these things have happened really with oncology as the proof point that this is possible.
So oncology, for better or for worse, and in this case for far better, has been a leader in trying to incorporating multiple data streams, I guess, that you pointed out, for real world data, building into real world evidence and applications. I want to make sure I understand though, and I hope everyone does, you rattled off a couple of the data streams, Amy, like that you were talking about combining and linking. So I think I heard you say EHR, biospecimens, what claims, was that one? What are the several that we now think we can all pull together, or at least link?
Right, and I didn't even sort of go through sort of a numeric list, which I usually do. Right. So, you know, practically speaking, when we think about real world data and real world evidence, the evidence streams can take many different types. So, for example, there are the classic types: electronic health record data, information in claims, information intentionally collected, for example, in registries. There's also information that comes from the patient, whether through patient reporting, such as symptoms, as in quality of life, or through sensors and data collection, for example, through the gyroscope in a watch and being able to create essentially actigraphy data. So that's another part of the type of real world data. And then there's also real world data sets that come, for example, from our laboratories. So for example, a cancer patient who is getting next generation sequencing testing, the variant call data that comes with the NGS can now be linked to the clinical data to create really a very broad picture of what's going on for this particular patient. And a key feature of these data sets is that they're longitudinal. They actually tell the patient's journey across time. And longitudinality not only gives you really a full view of what happens to individual patients, but they put data points in context. Let me give you an example. So for example, if you have a patient with lung cancer who's been diagnosed with lung cancer, and now the biopsy specimen is sent for next generation sequencing, you know that the timing of the NGS data related to the timing of the patient's diagnosis, and then also the timing of the treatments and how that relates to diagnosis, as well as the timing of follow-up. And so these different data points can be put into that longitudinal sequence to almost start to replicate what we would normally do in intentional case report form data collection for clinical trials.
Well, it's great how you not only pointed out that there are multiple data streams and that you can link them, but that you can tell a longitudinal story with them that parallels something that's familiar to many of us, which is a case report form, as it were, or even the time period of any person's electronic health record. So let us go to like the advanced course now. That wasn't advanced enough, Amy. So can you tell us just a little bit about what roles artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing, those kind of terms, sort of those analytical advanced tools on top of the linked data sources. Can you just give us a little sliver about your thinking along those lines, please?
So first of all, I think of those as capabilities, right? So artificial intelligence, NLP, machine learning, and even areas like blockchain are essentially capabilities that can be used within the context of our data landscape. They make us smarter and more efficient for the right purpose. Importantly, as we just sort of think about the question that you asked related to AI and NLP and ML, I'm just going to call this AI writ large just for shorthand. Practically speaking, I think about this in two big buckets for the purposes of this conversation. When the data sets are already prepared, then artificial intelligence as a way of quickly analyzing data, for example, to help with risk prediction. So these are really great mathematical tools that support key tasks in oncology, such as risk prediction. Meanwhile, another category of how we use AI and ML within the context of the space that we're talking about is to use those tools to help us curate data. So to help us now remove some of the tasks currently being done by human to extract the information from unstructured documents and put it into what looks like a case report form, now do that essentially mathematically using artificial intelligence, or as another example, start to support the reading of radiology and pulling out information into key data points. So those are ways that we might put AI and ML to use within this landscape. Practically speaking, the way that we can think about this is AI and ML make a lot of the work that we're doing faster and more efficient, and can essentially also improve the precision, but it's not perfect, and there are many places where it doesn't work well. So one of the tasks is to figure out the right use cases and to test it continuously as we start to apply a machine learning task. An example, again, going back to, for example, reading radiology films, is we can use artificial intelligence to, for example, quickly start to pick up whether or not these this chest X-ray suggests, actually chest CT, suggests that this patient has COVID-19, because we've got enough historical data with diagnosis of COVID-19, and now we can start to take the CT scans and the historical data and now apply AI algorithms to say COVID-19 yes or no, and get really good at that. But there are only certain tasks where this can be applied, and it's not perfect. So
the application of AI is something that will improve the speed and the efficiency of the process.
Mm-hmm.
So we can know stuff sooner and faster. Would it reveal, can these reveal things that would not otherwise have been revealed? And you tossed in blockchain as well. So in addition to kind of speeding it up and making it more efficient, does it actually generate new or different knowledge that we might not otherwise have had, in your opinion?
Certainly as we think about AI and ML, there are directions where we can learn through AI and ML patterns that were otherwise really difficult to see, right? And those patterns then can help us understand whether or not there is actually something important to be known. Practically speaking, for many of those right now, we still go back, especially when there's a clinical issue, we still go back and say, does that make sense to me? And the kind of classic example, not a medical example, so to speak, is the woman who's taking prenatal vitamins and other aspects and is also sort of going to Target and buying maternity clothes. Now that information being used to start to offer up baby-related advertising and other things, so that the AI and ML algorithms start to see patterns that start to signal, those individuals are particularly appropriate for this kind of advertising, and as an example of a pattern that would have otherwise been hard to see.
So it's not only faster and more efficient, it tells us more, stuff that we might not have. Got it, okay. One of the questions, and I just briefly alluded to it at the outset, has to do with the impact of the current public health crisis on aspects having to do with clinical trials, Amy. So one would be clinical trial enrollment. Another one might have to do, which might slow down research. Another one might have to do with the big push to speed up innovation. The big push to kind of adapt clinical trials and so forth. So I know you get just bombarded every day with COVID-related stuff, and laying that on top of your oncology background, what do you see insofar as the impact of COVID on innovation in oncology, whether it's clinical trials or the ability to enroll patients or any other factor? Have you thought about that a bit?
A lot. So let me sort of first hit on clinical trials writ large and some of the things that we're seeing, and then we'll hit on some oncology specific components. Certainly within the context of COVID-19, we're all talking about the issue of sort of the abrupt impact on ongoing clinical trials. And that's not a surprise. There are some activities though that are happening as it relates to ongoing clinical trials that are actually quite hopeful. So we've learned a lot more about the role of, for example, telemedicine and remote visits in order to continue to monitor patients within the context of clinical trials. It's given us the opportunity to stop and think about what's the impact potentially on data quality, whether or not we're able to have adequate follow-up for safety. So a lot of the things that we have as key questions related to the role of remote monitoring in clinical trials, we're actually now starting to pressure test because the demand is there to pressure test it. We've also seen within the context of the clinical trial space the need for regulatory flexibility that then we will ultimately be able to understand that regulatory flexibility and whether or not it should be potentially continued into the future. The remote clinical trial monitoring was actually part of a guidance we had previously written, but not well used. Another example of a guidance that's been written specifically for COVID-19 is the ability to deliver investigational product to a physician who is not necessarily a sub-investigator for the trial in order to make sure that the investigational product can be delivered to a patient closer to their home, for example. So there's different ways that we've been able to allow for the delivery of investigational product, which has happened within the context of clinical trials. We're also going to end up needing to think about, for example, the role of real-world data to fill in data gaps that have happened for clinical trials that are currently ongoing, and I see that as a space that we're going to learn a lot from in this period of time. But we've also needed to scratch our heads as it relates to what are critical variables that are related to COVID-19 that may impact patients who are on this trial that we may not be capturing. And I'm going to come back to that in the oncology setting in just a second. The last thing I would mention about clinical trials that's been interesting is a big push towards master protocols. We've talked a lot about master protocols in the oncology space and other places, but in fact, they're hard to do and they have not necessarily been given a lot of focus. But what we're seeing right now is a number of master protocols happening worldwide, testing several drugs simultaneously in the context of COVID-19. One example is the recovery trial where one of the arms was announced last week related to hydroxychloroquine. This is a trial from the UK. Another example is a program being run by Laura Esserman, where she took the I-SPY trial network that was focused on breast cancer and has repurposed that for patients in the ICU with COVID-19 and that master protocol approach. So we're seeing lots of focus on master protocols. The cancer patient with who is on clinical trials, right now there's a lot of work that's being done by the Oncology Center of Excellence to really understand what do we need to think about for the cancer patient who now is on clinical trials or is going to be in clinical trials in the future, and whether or not COVID-19, for example, needs to be considered within the context of eligibility criteria as a stratification variable. Are there statistical considerations that we need to think about? Because we don't even really know what's the long-term outcomes and impact of COVID-19, we need to sort of think about that because it may play a role as we think about the cancer patient being exposed to new therapies in the future. And a good example there is the coagulopathy of COVID-19 and whether or not that may have a role and needs to be considered both in our CRS as well as in study design, as well as potential adverse event monitoring and increased risk for patients who had had exposure to COVID-19 before.
So it sounds as though COVID is accelerating some developments that some of which were already underway. It's really fascinating, among the several things you cited, is that it sounded like you were saying that because of some data gaps in our traditional clinical trials, given those, we might use RWD to fill in those gaps. And are you projecting, not to put words in your mouth, might you be projecting or anticipating that some clinical trials could be replaced outright and or have arms built on real world data? Are you willing to go that far, maybe even in oncology? We haven't talked about this before, so I know this is a fresh question for you.
Like we were going down the AI path a few minutes ago, Cliff, now we're going to sort of take this one.
Okay.
First of all, I think COVID-19 has forced us to really think about the role of real-world data writ large. I saw Jeff Allen was on the prior panel. Certainly, we have a big book of work going on with Friends of Cancer Research and the Reagan-Udall Foundation called the Evidence Accelerator, where we're learning about the role of real-world data and real-world evidence in service of COVID-19. How do we use real-world data and real-world evidence to understand the natural history of the disease? Frankly, what we thought natural history of COVID-19 in March is very different than the way we understand it in June. In March, we didn't know about acute renal failure. We didn't know about the coagulopathy. We certainly didn't really think about late effects like potential risk of needing oxygen into the future or potential coagulation concerns. So the natural history of disease is a place where we're using real-world data. We're using real-world data to understand what treatments are patients receiving and what effectiveness might be, as well as safety concerns for those treatments, especially for the treatments that are being used off-label right now. We are using real-world data to start to understand what's the patterns of treatments and can we predict, for example, drug shortages because of increased amount of pressor agents being used in the ICU and so many patients in the ICU that now we need to think about if there's going to be drug shortages in certain parts of the country related to just essentially surge. We're using real-world evidence to think about how do we plan the clinical trials for the NIH program, for example. So there's a lot of places where real-world evidence is being put in place right now for COVID-19. Interestingly, we're using a lot of lessons learned in the oncology, real-world evidence and real-world data space to start to do that planning. Your question was about whether or not we think that that's going to start to replace clinical trials, because I heard you go there.
Yes.
I think I'm going to divide two things. One is I think that there's likely going to be a place of exploring what's the role of data that exists in electronic health records and other sources to fill in data gaps in our clinical trials data sets for when patients couldn't come to the clinic or have CRFs completed or have data filled in. And so that's going to be one place where I see this happening within the context of clinical trials. Certainly I see right now real-world evidence being used very clearly to plan clinical trials, and we're doing that at FTA. I also just came from a prior meeting where the goal was to use real-world data to understand where we are right now and whether or not clinical trials need to be done. And so, it's almost a replacement for clinical trials that if there's like absolutely nothing there, or, it suggests that we shouldn't prioritize one therapy over another from a clinical trials resources perspective, we can use real-world data to start to prioritize what do we allocate our clinical trials resources to do, and that's where I see that going. Other ways that real-world evidence might replace clinical trials, I think that the jury is still out, and I would sort of hesitate to say we know we can go there yet or not.
Got it. Well, you've got me persuaded on all those counts, Amy. We're going to go to audience Q&A at this point, and I'll just feed you one that's kind of similar to what I mentioned earlier, and that has to do with how does this really roll up into patient-centered care? We've been talking about all these data sources and all these methodologies and capacities and analytics and so forth. What kind of just sitting back and saying, that's wonderful, but in the crucible of shared decision-making and patient-centered care, what derives from that? What's the benefit that you see deriving from that, particularly if you might in cancer care?
So I want us to divide out two things. So shared decision-making and patient centricity versus personalization. Important, interrelated topics, but both of them are informed by how we have these evolving data sources that can help us. So certainly better data that helps us understand the generalizability of findings to patients like the person sitting in front of me really helps with personalization. Also, the activation and acceleration of science helps with personalization. It's the story of going from the early 2000s and looking at doublet chemotherapy for the management of lung cancer, and now being in the place today where most of the management of lung cancer is based on some kind of molecularly informed approach as we get there. So progressive personalization from the combination of data and better understanding of biology and understanding details of this person's tumor and their personal circumstances for personalization sitting right in front of us. Interestingly, in the COVID-19 story, what I see right now happening is these data sets are being used right now to personalize COVID-19 care better and better in a more refined way. It used to be very blunt. It was essentially oxygenation goes down, you end up in the ICU on a ventilator, full stop. And now there's a number of features that start to personalize care because of all these different data sources and understanding that goes to care. Your question was around also not only essentially starting to tailor individualized therapy, and I think that we're starting to see that, but also around shared decision-making. And shared decision-making not only requires a conversation around what matters, right? But it requires enough information to match what matters to what do we know in the current circumstances to be similar to your story or true. And the more information that we have about the distribution of circumstances and how patients will fare in different scenarios helps to inform that conversation. But shared decisions making still requires the criticality of the conversation. And so I think all of this evolving information is important to now get to more pointed conversations. I'll say one last thing, which is that the problem becomes the information can be so vast. How do I now integrate it quickly to better decisions of point of care and better conversations with my patient? And so I think that, what we've seen across time, and oncology has been a big space for this, is software and other elements that help us quickly blend a number of data points to start to understand more details similar to the patient like mine, so that now I can have as detailed as a conversation for this person without spending a year reading different textbooks trying to get there.
So that is fascinating, because I think what you just did was make the link between all those wonderful data sources and what a physician and a patient and her or his family could discuss, a cancer patient. So basically, if I'm not mistaken, we can amass data from these multiple data streams that you cited earlier and pull that data together and analyze it in a way that provides a patient population that might look like the patient sitting before you. When patients with your kind of risk factors and indications and so forth, we can pull together sort of a cohort of the multiple data sources to say, here's what we know about what happens with these patients, how they respond to treatments. Is that kind of what you said? I'd think about a funnel bringing into data, and at the bottom of the funnel is personalized.
The bottom of that funnel is personalized. And if we really sort of kind of take it to sort of the vision or the theory, when we talk about learning health systems, the easiest way to think about learning healthcare, and in 2010 we talked about it as rapid learning cancer care. It's that the person sitting in front of you, her care is informed by all people who looked similar to her in the past with similar circumstances. And then her care is reinvested into a system of overall continuously aggregating and updating data so that her care is her legacy and informs people who look similar in the future.
So she'll feed the database further.
Yes.
Got it. I'm gonna integrate two questions that have come in. They're kind of related, and they have to do with data quality and data trust. What can you say? We talked about you talked about EMR data and relying on that. What do you think about the quality of EMR data across the board? And similar question for real world data. Like, can you trust in it, especially if it comes from a source that may be from industry, for example? And I'm paraphrasing the question. So trust and validity, VHR data, RWD, since they're becoming so important.
So, data quality is sort of my main shtick, so to speak. And one of the things I always like to think about is that all data have warts. And so one of the challenges is that we shouldn't come to the question of data quality with an emotional response. It's just a transparent question that we have to think about with data quality. Clinical trials data are not perfect either. And so as we think about data quality, we need to make sure that we have consistently described it. And not only did we describe it, we have decided whether or not for the particular use that we plan to use that data set, the quality concerns are such that we can overcome them for the planned use at hand. Sometimes overcoming the quality concerns are through better curation. So I talked before about pulling data points out of unstructured documents like PDFs to kind of clean up the data. Sometimes it's through data linkage to fill in data gaps by, for example, bringing mortality data in from outside data sets. Sometimes we use analytic approaches to improve on data quality, such as approaches to fill in missing variables. Importantly, unless we're very transparent about how we document data quality and the implications for the analysis at hand, then we're not going to get very far. And so one of the things we really focus on at FDA is thinking about what does transparent and consistent documentation look like, and how can we move forward in that space. The trust issue is a bit different, but it's highly linked, right? So trust is partly linked to transparency and whether or not you really have confidence that somebody did what they said they were going to do. One of the things we've been working on in the COVID-19 context is the importance of, for example, just even deciding who in a data set has COVID-19. Think about it. How many people didn't get diagnostic tests so their COVID-19 was a presumptive diagnosis? And now how are we going to decide if that's really a person with COVID-19 we should follow over time? And so being able to be very transparent about how the person with COVID-19 was defined, and therefore how we're going to understand what that data set means is a critical baseline feature to generating trust that you can even understand what was going on in the first place. And being able to be very consistent across industry, whether it is a manufacturer or an academic, is a key part of this. We all have conflicts. So let's kind of just make sure that we're clear about them, and it makes it much easier.
Got it. Well, Amy, just a quick closing question for you, and you've covered so much territory, good gosh. Is there one sort of parting bit of advice or insight or challenge even to our listening audience here? You've covered so much ground, but was there sort of one distilled message, perhaps on behalf of yourself or the agency, that you might want to share with us at this point?
We're all living in tough and troubling times. We're all a part of a community. And I think we all feel the sense of urgency to do something in the same way we have the sense of urgency to do something cancer. My question and piece of advice is, let's figure out in a transparent way, what do we do as quickly as possible? And let's continuously share and learn from that. And let's teach each other. And then what we learn in COVID, let's take to other diseases.
Got it. Well, Amy Abernethy, I don't know what business you were involved until 1:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I don't know what you did thus far, but in the last half hour or so, you've done more than a full day's work. And gosh, given your rather senior position in the agency, we not only appreciate your time, but it's so clear that in your own career arc, you've brought so many perspectives and angles and insights and empathies to this field. It's just an honor and a privilege to have you speak with us today. And I think I'll sleep better tonight knowing that you're so high up in such an important agency. Much appreciation. We hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you, Dr. Amy Abernethy.
Thank you. It was an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much. And now I'll turn it back over to Bob Carlson.
Thank you so much, Amy and Cliff. Great discussion.